you are a recognized expert in the field of puppetry. You began your career as a puppet builder, and listen, puppets come in so many forms. Can you just give us and my listeners kind of a broad spectrum of what the definition of a puppet really is?
Well, that could be debated. There are long seminars that are being done on it, but I stick just with the simplest. I stick with the simplest, which is Bill Baird, who was also one of the greats of puppet theater. And actually, I had the great privilege of working with Bill before I went to work for Jim. So I actually have worked with two of the titans, as you mentioned, of the field. And Bill wrote a beautiful book called The Art of the Puppet, which simply says that a puppet is an inanimate object made to move by human intervention before an audience. So that leaves a very broad spectrum. And in the festivals, as you see in the book, we were very keen on making sure that that wide spectrum was addressed. And even forms that people might scratch their heads and say, was that a puppet? We really wanted the whole range. And that was very, very important to us. And I think because the field is so broad, it was very interesting. I do have a glossary at the end of the book, which has simple definitions of string puppet, hand puppet, marionette and string puppet are the same, hand puppets, string puppets, rod puppets, so that people get a sense. Because I really want the book to work. Of course, it is important for people in the field, and I've written it primarily with them in mind, but I really wanted to make sure that it was accessible and there was a point of entry for anyone who is interested in theater and theatrical forms, because I think that's a much broader group.
So tell me, how did you come to this world? Were you just one of those little kids that couldn't wait to get to Punch and Judy or to watch Sherry Lewis on television?
Not in the slightest. In fact, as I mentioned in the book, I'm like many, there are exceptions to the rule. There definitely are wonderful puppeteers who did know from the age of 5 that that's what they were going to do, but not the majority. Most of the artists that I talk about in the book really came to it as adults, and I came to it as an adult. I was studying French, if you will. I was studying French existential theater in college. So not exactly your average point of entry, but I'll date myself, it was the early 70s, and I was at the University of Vermont, and I was studying Alfred Jarry's Ubu and Eugene Ionesco's Rhinoceros, and Bread and Puppet was a big deal in Vermont at that point. And somehow the two fused in my brain, and I realized that visual theater was really what it was all about, and that's what really excited me as a means of communication.
Very exciting. So you had a kind of serendipitous meeting with Jim Henson and his lovely wife, Jane.
Yes.
Can you share that with us?
Well, as I said, I worked for Bill Baird before I worked for Jim, and Bill was a wonderful human being, but he also was not your typical artist. Well, maybe he's your typical artist. He was full of whimsy and fun, and he lived in the same building. I was lucky enough to be part of really this historic theater on Barrow Street. 59 Barrow Street was Bill Baird's theater for a period of time, and I was there towards the end of its tenure there. But Bill lived on one floor, and the workshop was on another, and he invited me to come down to his apartment, and Jim and Jane were there, and that was the beginning of my meeting them. And then also I got involved with the other connections where I got involved with the New York puppetry community. There's a puppetry guild, which was a very important thing. And I had come back to New York to study. Actually, I'll mention my first teacher, who was Penny Jones, who's now 90 something. And she was a great influence of getting started on all of this.
So was she a real mentor to you through this, Leslee?
Well, she was an important step along the way. I think she was really important. her enthusiasm. If you think I'm enthusiastic, you should meet Penny. It was quite wonderful, and I was able to, through her and understanding the way that she was working, and then working for Bill Baird, and then I worked with an artist who is mentioned a lot in the book. Penny is mentioned, but Eric Bass. I was lucky enough to work with Eric. Eric was doing the children's programming actually at the Theater of the Open Eye, which was started by Gene Erdman, the choreographer and dancer, who just recently passed at 104, I think. Her husband was Joseph Campbell, the famed mythologist. So it was I kind of felt like I got paid in Joseph Campbell lectures, which was not a bad thing to have happen. So I worked for a little while with Eric, and then he actually turned to me and said, would you like to do your own production? So I did do a production there, which was great. But then I started working much more extensively with the Henson Company.
You know, you have no idea how many times I refer to Joseph Campbell on this show. Because I'm all about living your bliss, and so is Joe Campbell. So for you to have been intertwined, when I read that in your book, I was very excited, because that's real royalty. I mean, you know, from several levels. My gosh, girl.
I was very lucky to be around royalty. It doesn't make me royalty, but it makes me very happy to have been with them.
This all gives you your journeyman knowledge. I love it. So tell us about the Henson years then, and how you were drawn into this. Oh, and before we do, you know, there's a beautiful little cartoon that Bill Baird actually drew for you that you've included in the book as a kind of send-off to you out into the world. I felt, you know, very sweet.
Yes. Are you showing it?
Everyone needs to look for that. No, I haven't found that yet.
Okay.
So tell us.
I could show it.
Find the Bill Baird.
It's fairly early in the book, because I do talk about, I actually have it right here. Well, I don't know how well you can see it.
That's lovely.
But Bill used to do cartoons on anything that wasn't moving. If it's still for too long, you had a cartoon on it. And so he would draw cartoons on napkins and wherever you were. And this was, because working for him, I was doing a mix of building puppets, a little bit of performing, although I was terrified of his high bridge, which other puppeteers will talk about that. And then I was also cataloging them and making sense of it. So he wrote Leslee of all Directions with much appreciation. So it's it's very close to my heart. So,
he knew you were ready for big things. He recognized that.
He may have known I was all over the map.
I love that. So
looking at it.
When you first met Jim Henson, I mean, did you realize that there was something extraordinarily special about this man?
Well, he had already established himself as quite extraordinary before I met him. So, I mean, his work really started in the 50s, and I was meeting him in the mid-70s. So he was already an exceptional artist, and everybody that was around knew that he was exceptional. His work had already, I mean, at that point, he had already done, and I actually, one of the reasons for the book, if I just might divert for a second, one of the real reasons for the book is so much has been written about Jim's work. Certainly Sesame Street, The Muppet Show, Dark Crystal, Labyrinth, so many of the properties that are so important to the world. And there's a lot written about that. But there's almost nothing, as I look through, there's almost nothing written about his love of this field of puppetry. He was very, very dedicated and very committed to it on a global arena. And it was very, very key to him and to who he was, and to the start of the festivals, which is obviously long precedes this book. To put the U.S. artists on this global stage with other global artists, and to have it be recognized in this country in the way that it is recognized in so many other countries around the world. That was really the
Well, let's talk about that for a minute, because I understand really in the early years, Jim Henson set out to explore what was going on in Europe in puppetry. And he spent a lot of time traveling and taking it. And that's why I asked you if you realized, you know, how special he was. We all know how talented he was, but then there's special. There's that thing inside certain people where they're always searching for something else. And I get the impression that Jim Henson was very much that, because I understand that he was a workaholic, and everything he went into 1,000%. And this whole area of puppetry, and as I understand, he was interested in television at the same time, so he wound the two together, of course, in his beginnings. You know,
actually, he started with his interest in television. He puppets was a means to get onto television when he was a kid. There was an opportunity. A show was looking for a puppeteer, and he said, "Oh, well, I guess I'll become a puppeteer," and took out a couple of books from the library and figured out how to do it.
It's amazing.
That launched the career. And then when you say about him traveling, I do mention it was actually not that long a period of travel at that point. But in 1958, it was a turning point in his career where he was really trying to decide, am I really pursuing puppetry? Am I pursuing an art career, or am I pursuing a film or at that point television career? And it was what he saw when he went in 1958, which partly we're just gleaning. You know, we can't tell exactly what it was, which actual pieces really turned him on the most. But we do know that he came back and said, "This is it. This is important. This is a global art form that is worth dedicating my time to."
And it's interesting that his daughter, Cheryl, became so involved with you all. And I know, especially in the Jim Henson Foundation and for the festivals, I did read somewhere that he was such a workaholic that his family actually felt that if they wanted to see him, they had to work with him. I mean, and I suppose that's true.
Well, I can't completely speak to that, or I won't. But all of the kids are actually involved in the field in one way or another. So at this point, Lisa and Brian are both running the Jim Henson Company. Cheryl is the president of the Jim Henson Foundation, and she really is the backbone of the field right now. She really is. Her generosity to the field is enormous and very, very critical to it. So the fact that she wrote such a beautiful foreword for the book meant a lot to me, and
it's very moving.
It speaks volumes. And then Heather Henson, who I talk about in the book, also is now a performing artist, and we have some of the images of her work in the book as well.
That's very exciting. You know, I watched a short piece that Jim Henson did, which was without puppetry, called Timepiece.
Yeah, it's a great piece.
And I found that so fascinating. It's really kind of a little exploration of rhythm and playing with a kind of surreal quality of it. And it's interesting to me that both he and Frank Oz were so drawn to film in that way. And of course, Frank Oz went on to do so many things. I mean, we remember him here for really Yoda more than anything, but directing substantial films, you know, What About Bob and Little Shop of Horrors. And I saw a recent interview with Frank Oz, and he was talking about the generosity of Jim Henson. And of course, this is what permeates your book all the time, and this beauty about preserving the art of puppetry. Right. So when it came to establishing a festival, was this something, you know, I know he had a lot of projects, but was this something he really wanted to achieve for just the sake of puppetry as an art form?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The idea for the festivals, it wasn't my idea. I fortunately helped to make them come to life. But he had already, I mean, as we talk about in the book, in the progression, he had already started it wasn't called the Jim Henson Foundation because he was very self-effacing. It was the Henson Foundation. He would never call it the Jim Henson Foundation. It was the Henson Foundation because it was meant to involve all of the family. And actually a lot of the family members were on the initial board and obviously continued through it. But the idea of that was to be able to start giving to help other performers, other puppeteers, be able to do their own work. It was kind of a double-edged sword. Jim was so successful at what he was doing once it became known as the Muppets and Sesame, that people would go in for an interview and they would, for a job, and they'd say, well, give me a Muppet. Well, they couldn't give him a Muppet. It wasn't theirs to give. And so a lot of the motivation of the foundation starting was to make sure that artists were really starting to explore their own. And I do quote, there is a piece, a couple of different places with quotes of things that Jim wrote about that. And I won't misquote him here, but they're in the book as far as people learning to do their own and developing their own. And that was very important. The festivals then were an outgrowth of that. The festivals, one person that I mentioned in the book quite a bit was this woman, Nancy Staub, who was one of the motivators, instigators, I guess is the right word, for the start of the foundation. And she'd been talking to him about doing festivals. She did the 1980 UNIMA festival, and UNIMA is the Union Internationale de la Marionnette. It's the international organization of puppeteers. And it was a big deal to be able to do that first UNIMA festival in the United States. Up until then, these festivals would go from one part of Europe to another part of Europe, and U.S. was not part of that world.
Interesting.
So doing the New York festival was kind of a part two, and it was when Jim and his daughter Cheryl went to a festival, a puppetry festival at MIT, that they saw the work that you so much pointed to, that I adore also, of Enno and Anna Podell, Herman. And when they saw this work, Cheryl talks about it beautifully in the book. I won't, again, try to misquote, but it's a very, very, very powerful piece of theater. And it was the starting point in many ways. Well, it was the piece that we chose first for the festivals, because it was that piece that had sparked it's time. It sparked the sense that it was time to really do this festival. It had been talked about and thought about for a while, but now it was the time. And to note, the first festival was in 1992. That's 10 years since the foundation had been founded. So in those 10 years, a lot of great American puppetry had been developed. And so there was a body of work that could be shown on stages with the best in the world, which was the starting point for the whole thing.
So I just want to point out that in 1936, Jim Henson was born. In that same year, 170 puppeteers attended the first American Puppetry Conference and Festival in Detroit. In 1960, Jim and Jane Henson attended their first Puppeteers of America Festival. And I wish I could have been a fly on the wall for the meeting that took place between you, Cheryl Henson, Joseph Papp, one of the most influential producers in the history of American theater, and Jim Henson in 1989, as you discussed the beginnings of a New York Festival of Puppetry.
It was pretty special.
Yeah.
I do talk about it in the book. Actually, the book is dedicated to both Jim Henson and Joe Papp, because they are two legendary forces in the theater world, both of whom unfortunately passed before we did the first festival, in the process as we were starting. And neither of whom lived to see it finished, but without the two of them, it would never have happened. So that was the important starting point. Yeah, the meeting was very brief, very brief. Jim had sent a letter to, we decided that the public theater, which had at that time 5 small theaters, which were perfect scale for puppet theater, that would be the best place. It's also such an important institution in New York theater. It was really an incredible imprimatur on the whole adventure. And so Jim sent a letter to Joe Papp. Joe Papp said, sure. He came to the office, and in the office was Jim Henson, Cheryl Henson, and myself. And Joe Papp walks in. I don't even think he had sat down yet. And he said, "Great idea. We should do it. What do we talk about?" And I don't remember exactly what we talked about. That line is forever seared in my brain, but we fleshed it out.
I love that.
Kind of wonderful.
But you say the meeting was short and then it was left on your shoulders. We lost the wonderful Jim Henson,
Right.
and in an untimely early death at age 53, which is inconceivable. And yet you and Cheryl marched forward, even in the face of all this sorrow. And then, of course, in 1991, you lost Joe Papp, as you said. This must have been very difficult.
Yeah, as I say in the book, perhaps it was with Jim's openness and our naivete, but yeah, we did, and actually, we were very fortunate in that. So, I mean, Cheryl obviously she also had just lost her father, so I mean,
That's right.
it was a lot going on, but we were able to do it, and we brought in an amazing team. That's just the two of us. We
Okay.
brought in an amazing team. We were able to bring in Ann Denon, who became our third. And she was really the marketing and press acumen that we needed. And as Cheryl said, I figured out things as I went. You know?
And you sure did. And we're going to talk about that in part 2 of this interview. Leslee Asch, thank you so much for being on Center Stage. We walked into that world of wonder of puppetry, and we're talking about her marvelous book, Out of the Shadows. Leslee, I look forward to part 2 of this interview. Hang around. We will finish. We will finish. This is Pamela Kuhn, and the curtain is now down on Center Stage.